I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor here at Gold Derby. I'm here with Emmy winner Jan Miles, editor on season 4 of Netflix's flagship drama, The Crown. First of all, Jan, this season, we were saying offline, was probably the show, one of the show's strongest. But you were tasked with piecing together new narratives that focus on iconic historical figures like Princess Diana and Margaret Thatcher. There was a lot of anticipation about those characters joining the show. So I just wanted to know, first of all, with so much anticipation for Diana and her introduction, talk us through the first moments when we meet this young, slightly elusive, almost angelic-like Diana.
Yeah, it was I guess it's the history everyone's been waiting for, isn't it? It's the sort of. I mean, on previous seasons, I was having a history lesson as much as the audience was having a history lesson, but it was quite fascinating to come to season 4 and finally sort of hit the 80s. The fashion, the music, and everything all start to feel. You feel like you're sort of now alive in that sort of same period. Certainly for me, anyway. I'm old enough to sort of live through the 80s, but when Diana came in, it was the. I mean, the episode Fairy Tale, which I edited, which is the one we're talking about, I guess, is that it was sort of kind of. It was kind of fascinating how young she was and how naive and beautiful and innocent and sort of, and that's what sort of struck me the most. And I think it was, brilliantly portrayed with Erin. It's just, I think it was, and in the sort of conveying of the episode was we sort of started off in the sort of early montage with her kind of with the engagement and the sort of family, sort of this quite sort of comedic kind of telephone call, and I sort of remember the moment when I sort of did the edit where when they sort of said, what did she say, and I answered, I went to the sort of cut of young Diana, which he says yes in, but I decided to sort of hold that moment back, and then Charles answers the question sort of yes, and it was that kind of sort of magic, and it really hit home on what it's like to meet a prince, and the sort of fantastical kind of fairy tale kind of atmosphere, sort of driving away in this small mini metro from sort of Windsor Castle, kind of, it's not, and we sort of have played with this sort of notion of her, of who died. I think who we think, we certainly what we think who she was, but sort of playing Diana Ross, as she sort of leaves, you can sort of just barely hear it in the car, and then sort of where's she gone now, and then you sort of hear her singing this song, which I imagine all young girls do, it sort of punks the air in your happiness and your euphoria, so, and it was always the episode is quite revealing, sort of once we get sort of further into it. So I think for the first sort of act of the film, it's sort of it's every girl's dream, right? This is kind of, this is sort of Cinderella, I guess, right?
Yeah. I totally agree with that. It's like Diana, we have all these preconceived notions of her, but I think a lot of us will remember the beginnings, at least, before she was so jaded, that she was quite innocent and angelic and young. And I think what we don't quite appreciate for the untrained eye is how the editor can really hone in on the emotion without us even realizing. And a great example is a scene that I know you've spoken about before, because I watched the clip at the Netflix FYC site about when Charles and the Queen are talking about the duty and the need for him to marry this woman, and the fireworks are going off in the window. I'd love for you to talk us through that again, because you'd think that there's nothing to it, it's just two people talking, but it was so complicated what you were able to achieve there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting scene, isn't it? It's the scene when sort of mummy comes to tell you off, isn't it? And it's sort of it's the stakes are slightly higher in this instance, yeah. And there was more. There was quite a fair bit to the original scene, that I line cut, a fair bit that was sort of slightly gathering more information. But it was really interesting. The scene was shot sort of various ways, but I sort of felt like the two, mum and child sort of, sort of occupy the sort of window spaces, and the sort of fireworks was this sort of playful was shot practically, which sort of slightly made it trickier because obviously, in some instances it was flashing red on her face and flashing blue on his, when I sort of, so I did a fair bit of sort of split screening in order to kind of sort of keep the two people in the same color space. But I really liked the strength of that, of the sort of power of someone having a conversation that's sort of not really looking at you, and she's sort of looking out the window, and I sort of played it deliberately quite often on the back of her and the back of him, so not to entirely read his emotions, because all emotions quite often, really live in the eyes, and when you sort of deliver, when you see people from the front, the eyes sort of the sort of eyes are the doorways to the soul, that the emotive sort of soul. And so I sort of held back that, so it sort of became this sort of, I mean, simply written but effective sort of speech of duty, and you could kind of see him sort of crumbling in the sort of in this sort of slightly rear profile. And I thought it's just fascinating that he sort of delivered this sort of old story of what sort of happened before, and that this is sort of duty for sort of country, and and sort of keeping the sort of crown, the importance of sort of maintaining the crown whilst all others around us sort of crumble, and then just sort of savoring that moment for the end of sort of, then they sort of face each other off. And interestingly, in the Ben Caron sort of directed it, in the final sort of exchange, when you sort of see that he sheds a tear, when I went back to Olivia, she sort of delivered the sort of slightly sort of cold face kind of, sort of non-emotionless version. She gave a sort of little glint, but then she left the room. And originally in my sort of first cut, I had her sort of leave the room, and it sort of left you were sort of left slightly in it, sort of gasping, sort of, oh my God, she sort of delivered a killer blow and then delivered another killer blow.
Yeah.
So I kind of left it in that exchange of just that you saw something in her that was like, I'm sort of doing this, I'm ever so sorry, but this is the way it is, so I hope that sort of came across. I think it did. And then I sort of, and interestingly, when we did the mix, the guys at Boom, the sound guys, they sort of built the fireworks slightly. We sort of let the fireworks disappear a bit, and then the fireworks come back, and then that sort of brings us to the next morning, the sort of fireworks crescendo at the end.
Yeah.
It's a very simple scene, but it's really effective, and I think it was, I think it's extraordinary what you go looking for when you can't see.
Yeah. It could have just been the two of them sitting on a couch chatting, but instead, the way that it was framed, shot, and then edited was one of the highlights of the episode, and perhaps the season. The other thing I loved as well, which I find really good editors do, is I really appreciate when two people are talking that we're focused on the receiver's face more, because it was all about this, what he was having to hear, and the stakes were getting higher and higher in terms of what the Queen was saying. And it's only when he turns to her that her face comes into focus. We turn back to him and he has the tear. Were there any other ways that you were thinking of doing that, or was it quite apparent to you when you had all the coverage that you had a pretty good idea that that's how you wanted to play out?
I think I tend to, I sort of cut with my heart first and my instinct. That's kind of how I approach anything. And there was, it was pretty covered. It was extensively. There was a wide of the room. There was a sort of wide of the two of them. There was a looser shots at the window. There was slightly sort of track pull focus shots. So I used a few between the two of them, but I kind of cut that pretty much. It other than that change at the end, and sort of elongated pauses that I sort of extended stuff that that it sort of pretty much sort of, I kind of instinctively cut it that way. It felt right, other than her leaving at the very end, and there is many ways to do things. It's really interesting. I find these things, it's sort of like the Crown has that ability to, I think it's Peter's writing, when Peter sort of goes down he sort of drills down in a sort of slightly metaphoric kind of universe. And I've had quite a few scenes with the brilliance of his writing. It goes back to sort of Assassins in seasons 1. I thought that, with Churchill had some great monologues in that. But this one sort of feels really crowny. It's that I always remember the feeling of when I watched one of the episodes that Stephen Daldry watched, and I think it's when Elizabeth becomes the Queen, and there's a scene on a plane, and there was an example of that, and he sort of says, "This is what's happening." And Philip's saying, like, we're going to need to do this and that. And sort of Philip says, who is telling us to do this? And it's like the Crown. Who's the Crown? It's like the Crown is this bigger thing. And that's kind of, this scene felt like it slightly hinted back at that moment, like the sort of Crown, which is that kind of, always wins, right? This sort of, this big entity that's bigger than all of them, right? This sort of thing. That's a fascinating idea when you think about that. And this scene, and to sort of slightly, I remember that scene from that episode. I can't remember the episode name, but so what I slightly did is when I temp scored the music, I took a version of the slightly, which is a little sort of tinkle of the duck theme, which is the scene, that theme goes all the way back to that moment.
Yeah.
So it's just really loosely buried in there, and it was Martin Phipps's version of it, and I think it's still in there today. So for the real, I mean, most people would never notice, but it is there's a little mirror of reflection of music that dates all the way back to that moment of her becoming Queen. So
yeah, that's amazing. That's the kind of little touches that us crazy fans really appreciate. That reminds me, towards the end of the episode, when Emma Corrin as Diana walks out in that huge iconic dress, the wedding dress. Again, that crowny concept that you're so astutely talking about, I think that really rings true for that as well. Was there anything in particular that you were doing in that big reveal that we perhaps wouldn't have noticed?
Well, I mean, I get everyone wants to see the wedding dress, isn't it? And it's sort of, we sort of teased it with, when she wakes up in the morning and it's sort of on the mannequin, and we sort of quite cleverly sort of held that back, sort of bends, sort of directs that way slightly. But the sort of big reveal was, we weren't going to go to the wedding, and the big train, this longest train dress, which is, iconic and beautiful, and it's sort of, it's just kind of what I'd like about, I find really fascinating about The Crown is it sort of, Ben shot it and there was some people dressing her and stuff, and I kind of threw that stuff away. It was sort of, the veil went down, you could see there was sort of shadowy, aids and maids, dresses, or whatever you call them, sort of wiping frames and stuff. But I just sort of felt like the way I cut it was Charles was sort of looking at his own reflection in the mirror, and I never really revealed the mirror, right? I never really showed you the mirror shot. So for me, it felt like it was nearly like him looking at her. She was the mirror, So in the scene, in the room he's in, he's sort of looking at the mirror, and she was sort of facing him. But when he finally raised up and sort of looked forward, that's when I felt like it was the right place. And there's a lot of conversations we had that was her when she was sort of leaving the room and sort of revealing the big sort of the dress. But it's also the moment you're kind of going, don't do this, right? Please don't go and do this, right? It's this kind of, it's a sort of really interesting point in storytelling that, we know what them, obviously their marriage has had highs and lows, of course, like all marriages, but that sort of moment, knowing that historic moment, sort of going into that, and that's kind of what that shot sort of represented. And that, interestingly, it was scripted that it ended on that shot, leaving, and my instinct was to cut back to Charles, and when I brought the narration, the fairy tale narration in from the Archbishop, which is originally from the archive of the wedding, that sort of narrative of what fairy tales mean, and this sort of line that sort of, when it came to, marriages and now they'll live, this is just the sort of the beginning, right? It felt really true, rang true to me, that there's these people at the beginning of this journey of whatever we saw in this episode is, was a bit peppery, right, in places, right? There was some some stuff happened in this episode that you thought you saw the telltale signs of Camilla and etc. But to end on Charles and that line felt good to me. It sort of felt, going what you were just asking me in the previous scene. The crown ends the story, not Diana in the dress. So for me, that type of storytelling is important. I think that's, as much as it would have been fantastic to leave that episode with her walking away in the dress, I was sort of kind of being diligent to the storytelling.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because when I'm just immersed in it and enjoying the performances, some of that stuff will go over my head. But of course, it's so critical to the story. I have a more general question for you, Jan, because whenever I interview editors, it's this thing that's always in the back of my mind. And sometimes the editors will tell me, no, it is what it is, and you just have to suspend disbelief. I'd like to hear what you think. So this is the concept. When I'm watching a show or a film, and I see that the editor has obviously doesn't have enough coverage from the DP and the director, and a character in one shot is doing something and then in another shot it's doing something else, it takes me out of the story. I hate it. What are your thoughts on that? That's got to be the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges for an editor day to day, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it's something we call, it's that very powerful line, continuity, isn't it? Which is sort of, it's just sort of like the the rule book of editing, isn't it? And it's sort of only when you sort of learn your craft slightly more, as you realize that continuity is meaningless, and you sort of break it, and you sort of deliberately break it. But when continuity forces itself upon you, it's impossible to escape from it. It's like the sort of evil curse of editing, isn't it? It's what you pick up. It's something, it's really fascinating what you say. Is when you do watch something, quite often, even if you say you've never sort of thought about editing, you're obviously quite aware of that sort of work. But if you're just someone who just watches the film, enjoys it, obviously you know that it's pieced together, but innately something's wrong, don't you? And that's what it sort of rejects you from the picture, it rejects you from the story, and it's as simple as the continuity is wrong, and there isn't the shot, or someone's made something from a shot, or and it's sort of slightly, pieced together in order to serve what they wanted it to be, but wasn't shot or wasn't there. And it's amazing that all audiences, regardless of your knowledge of filmmaking, pick up on that, right? You just do. Somehow it doesn't feel sort of in the sort of, I don't know, the laws of gods of filmmaking, it does feel like that sometimes. And don't get me wrong, even with the best scripts and the best stories, this stuff happens. It does happen, that it does. We're all fallible, we're all human, right? We're telling stories about these humans that triumph and fail, and filmmaking is that same process. It really is. And I think editing is that sort of, I sometimes sort of pinch myself, because sometimes it's sort of, like sometimes I make huge mistakes. When I'm assembling, I sort of do something, or maybe I finish something and I move something around, and I sort of do it in a rough way, and I look back and it knocks some sound out, and I go, oh, I really like that. It's like in the mistakes comes some of the best stuff. So it's in itself, if you think about it, the sort of destruction of it and the continuity of it, all up for grabs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But however, going back to what you're saying, circling back to what you're saying, if you're asking to look for something that isn't there, you'll never find it.
Yeah, true.
That's a fact.
It would. Yeah. I think anyone like me who has a slight bit of OCD would probably not be a very good editor. That's all I'm saying. So, but my final question, very briefly, is, as I foreshadowed at the beginning of our chat, you will forever be known as Emmy winner, Jan Miles. I'm wondering what your fondest memory of winning the Emmy in 2014 was for Sherlock.
Well, I think my fondest memories was that I got to go on stage and say "No shit, Sherlock."
Yes.
If I rightly remember, I think someone quoted it in the LA Times. I think I think the winners. I mean, the craft winners are not nowhere near as much fun as the actors, right? The actors and all directors go up and have a bit of. But the Emmys is notorious for people having a bit of a bit of a jibe. I think I was quoting you at times the first person that slightly sort of spiced up the night, you know, with some, which was, you know, it's only a small swear word, but I think it felt the right thing to say. But yeah, but it was good. I really enjoyed it. I never expected it. That I do that work. All the work I do, I don't expect. You know, if people enjoy it, that's the main thing. If you get accolades for it, all so much better. But it's not how I work. It's not how we roll. We make stories, and if people like yourself or other people say I watched it, really enjoyed it, that's it. That's it. I'll be more than happy to. You can send Emmys over as many as you like, but if they don't come, so be it.
Exactly. Yeah, and at least people are enjoying it. And on that note, we certainly enjoyed this particular episode. Season 4 itself was great. And thank you so much for your time today. Really.
No, thank you. No, thank you very much. Nice to meet you, Rob. Yeah.